Nothing is working. Nothing is working today. Hello, everyone. I am so happy to see you. If you clicked on this video, you likely already know that my name is Sundown, and this is Logically Free-Spirited, a channel where I talk about all things relating to science and spirituality while hopefully always remaining grounded yet open-minded. And I've recently been doing a lot of live focus sessions also, but today we are here to talk about episode 8 of the incredible podcast, the Telepathy Tapes. And if you are not caught up with us, I will link to the playlist in the description box below and on the screen. Also, I really hope this is in focus, but let's get into episode 8 of the Telepathy Tapes. It is titled Gatekeepers of Truth, Telepathy, and the Spelling Controversy. And we are going to start by going all the way back to the 1990s, where we will discuss some of the crimes and controversies that have contributed to where we are with facilitated communication today. In the podcast, Ky references high-profile court cases involving FC, and these cases involve some things that I'm not sure I'm allowed to talk about on YouTube without being further punished by the algorithm, but I'm going to try. In the 1990s, there was a wave of cases involving abuse allegations that were either proven to be false or the case was dismissed for one reason or another. Starting in 1992 with the Boynton case in Maine, which is especially important because Janice Boynton, which I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, but she became one of FC's most vocal, what's the word I'm looking for? She's anti-FC. You get it. At the time, she had only about an hour of unpaid training and yet still facilitated messages that led to serious abuse allegations against a child's family. The case was ultimately dismissed and no charges were filed, but the damages were done. Later, Boynton publicly acknowledged that she had unintentionally influenced the messages, and now she actively speaks out against the use of FC. In 1993, there were 3 more, one in California, Maryland, and Canada. And in 96, there was another one in Canada. And then 99, there was one in England. And I've linked everything I could find in the description box. Unfortunately, there have been other cases since then, not just false abuse allegations, but also an instance involving suicide and several involving consent. The unfortunate result of these was not criticism or condemnation of the individuals and their actions, but rather full-on blame for the communication methodology as a whole. Many of these facilitators were poorly or improperly trained, and they should not have been working with anyone yet. It's kind of like someone crashing a car because they never learned how to drive properly, but instead of blaming them for getting behind the wheel or someone else for giving them their keys, we blame the car. That's essentially what's happening here. This led to ASHA, the American Speech Language Hearing Association, releasing their stance on facilitated communication, which we are going to break down. Before I start, please note that I have linked ASHA's full position statement in the description box below, so you can follow along or check it out for yourself later. Okay, so this is coming from the Ad Hoc Committee on Facilitated Communication and the Rapid Prompting Method, which I really wonder why spelling to communicate isn't thrown in the title, but anyway. The version currently on their site is updated and, in their own words, a stronger stance against facilitated communication. The original position statement was released in 1995, and this one was updated in 2018. And while that really wasn't that long ago, it wouldn't actually shock me if they updated again soon, specifically because of the telepathy tapes and the fire it's started. Anyway, the statement reads as follows. It is the position of the American Speech Language Hearing Association that facilitated communication is a discredited technique that should not be used. There is no scientific evidence of the validity of FC, and there is extensive scientific evidence produced over several decades and across several countries that messages that are authored by the facilitator rather than the person with a disability. Furthermore, there is extensive evidence of harms related to the use of FC. Information obtained through the use of FC should not be considered as the communication of the person with a disability. It adds that this stance is due to lack of scientific validity and reliability, and that they updated and strengthened their position because in the years since the initial release, quote, there has been no credible scientific evidence of benefit and only growing evidence of the lack of efficacy and harms of FC. They add that FC may hinder or delay access to appropriate services and effective forms of intervention, including augmentative and alternative communication, applied behavior analysis, functional communication training, and other empirically supported interventions. And then it references the court cases I mentioned earlier. ASHA does acknowledge the human right to communication, citing the 2006 United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 2014 International Communication Project, and the 2016 Communication Bill of Rights by the National Joint Committee for the Communication Needs of Persons with Severe Disabilities. These declarations all emphasize that communication is a basic human right, that every person should have the right to express themselves in ways that they can access and to be heard and responded to with respect. So why is FC not among these ways? Because it requires more than one person, the speller and the facilitator. ASHA argues that using a facilitator undermines the autonomy and freedom of expression because the messages are not reliably the voice of the person with the disability, but rather the facilitator's voice. However, on at least a slightly positive note, ASHA clarifies that this position does not apply to independent typing without facilitator influence. So my interpretation of that is that someone like Akil, who spells completely independently, would be considered acceptable by ASHA standards. But here's the issue. None of the people like Akil could have gotten to this point without using a facilitator. They had to learn, right? They had to grow. Essentially, this is saying that you can run a marathon, but you're not allowed to train for it, right? You're not allowed to learn how to crawl, not allowed to learn how to walk. You're not allowed to build strength or coordination or confidence. You just have to get up one day and run a marathon. It's like outlawing swimming lessons and then blaming people for drowning. Anyway, to explain why they don't believe that the messages produced via spelling are that of the person with the disability, they reference several studies, and we are going to get into those in a little bit. But ultimately, they conclude that there is no scientific evidence that, one, FC provides access to communication, again, because they claim that the authorship is that of the facilitator, and two, that there is no scientific evidence that individuals achieve independence in communication through the use of FC. So, like I said, get up and run a marathon. Counter to this, ASHA states that there is sufficient scientific evidence that supports their conclusion that the facilitator is the author of any communication and that anything contrary to this is based on anecdotal reports, testimonials, and descriptive studies demonstrating that FC is clearly pseudoscience in their opinion. And as such, the use of facilitated communication results in several harmful and negative consequences in that FC, one, is not an effective form of communication and does not provide access to communication because, again, they aren't the author. Two, it denies the user access to their human right of communication, again, because of authorship. Three, it costs time and money that cannot be retrieved and hence reduces opportunities for access to timely, effective, and appropriate treatment for independent communication. Translation here is that disabilities are expensive and any money put towards FC is money taken from other, in their opinion, better methods. Four, FC gives false hope to individuals and families with little to no speech. And five, it has been associated with significant preventable harms arising through the false allegations of abuse and maltreatment. They conclude by reiterating that the aforementioned risks outweigh any anecdotal reports of effectiveness, and essentially they kind of threaten speech-language pathologists by saying that proceeding with FC despite this information could result in additional risks in terms of their own liability, and adds that it's their responsibility to warn others who are even considering using FC. It's also important to note that ASHA is in charge of the certification of speech-language pathologists. and that in order for them to get a certificate of clinical competence and do basic things like bill insurance, it seems that they actually have to be a member of ASHA. So, yeah. Ironically, the position concludes by stating that ASHA strongly supports further research, just not into methods like FC. The result of the 1995 statement had a swift and severe rippling effect. All schools and organizations using any form of supported typing had to halt these activities immediately. This is why Katie's account of Houston's experience in school is so heartbreakingly common. She appears again in this episode of the Telepathy Tapes, and she explains that Houston learned to spell over the course of a summer towards the end of his high school years. When it happened, Katie was understandably overjoyed, and she called his teachers to tell them, but almost immediately, one of Houston's teachers told Katie that facilitated communication had been discredited. She had no idea at the time. This was then reinforced later when Katie had a rather intimidating meeting with several school representatives after she tried to improve Houston's education upon discovering his competence. But their reasoning was ASHA's stance on facilitated communication. I want to sidebar on this for just a moment also. We've learned from earlier episodes that schooling for students like Houston often involves preschool level lessons on repeat. So I wondered how they essentially graduate or complete high school without what many would consider a traditional education, wondering if they just simply age out. And please know, I am not an expert on this, and I have no personal experience with the special education system. However, I know that several of my viewers, or at least many of my viewers, are parents, teachers, caregivers, or even autistic themselves. So if anyone has any experiences that contradict this or anything to add or corrections, please leave them in the comments. But from what I understand, yes, most students with severe disabilities essentially age out of high school. Under U.S. federal law, students with disabilities are entitled to free public education until they turn 21 or in some states 22. Technically, this doesn't involve traditional academic curriculums. These students will participate in classes focused around basic skills and communication, vocational activities, and essentially when they reach of age, they graduate by aging out rather than completing standard coursework. This graduation results in a certificate of completion or a certificate of attendance or sometimes a modified special education diploma, depending on the school or the state or the district. Okay, back on track. So, facilitated communication comes out and makes waves. Then there are the court cases, the fallout blaming the method rather than the practitioner, and then comes ASHA's statement, which resulted in supported typing services being completely halted in schools and everywhere else. And ASHA's statement was that facilitated communication was not to be trusted because the messages have been repeatedly proven to be that of the facilitator rather than the person with the disability. But that claim feels increasingly difficult to reconcile when you consider the examples we've been exploring throughout this series, like Houston clearly verbalizing the letters as he points to them during the Uno card experiment, or all of these children typing fluently in languages that their parents and teachers and caregivers don't even speak. And then there are the descriptions of physical sensations, things that caregivers and doctors have no way of knowing, like when Akil explained that he couldn't always feel his body, or Houston explaining that sometimes he flaps his hands so that he can sense where they are. Ky adds that it's a clear form of gaslighting when these schools and organizations and institutions continually tell these parents that despite what they are seeing and experiencing themselves, that they're wrong and that that's not what's happening, that their children are not doing these things and that they're just not in there. So why is this occurring? We've got to go back to the research. So I mentioned in my last episode that the Talk Tracks series is worth listening to, and I sincerely stand by that. So much so that I'm going to reference a recent episode of it titled The Skeptic Who Couldn't Debunk the Telepathy Tapes, because it's very apropos. We have heard before that there are around 40 anti-FC articles out there from the early days of the methodology and around 100 positive studies that are all more recent. This is a substantial amount of research that Ky was hoping journalists would take the time to review and report on. However, It wasn't a journalist, rather an engineer called Becca that set out to disprove the telepathy tapes. And then she herself became a guest on the podcast. I've linked the specific episode below. Becca took the time to research and analyze over 100 studies and research papers, and what she found was essentially that the critics of FC always reference the inability of the spellers to pass a double-blind test. And I've seen the same thing referenced time and time again in my comments section. Essentially, the double-blind or the message passing test goes something like this. The facilitator is shown a word or image, let's say a cat, and the speller is shown a different word or image, a dog. Then the speller is asked to type what they saw. In this case, it should be dog, but oftentimes instead they're typing cat. And at first glance, it seems obvious. This must mean that the facilitator is the one authoring the message. That's what they saw, right? But how does that work when the facilitator and the speller aren't touching, which is what's happening? I mean, how exactly is the facilitator controlling what's being spelled if they're not touching? Skeptics point to the idiomotor effect. And they go into it in the talk tracks, and I know I've mentioned it before, but I'm going to go over it again. To understand the idiomotor effect, it's easiest to first go over the story of Clever Hans. Clever Hans was a horse in 1900s Germany who could allegedly do math, among other things. His owner would ask him questions like, what's 3 plus 2? And Hans would tap his hoof 5 times. He could also apparently tell the time, identify colors, spell out words, guess ages. He was looked at as this genius animal who somehow mastered human language and arithmetic. But eventually, a psychologist named Oscar ran a series of tests, and what he found was that Hans wasn't actually doing the math or guessing the ages. He was reading these subtle cues from the humans around him, like a slight shift in posture or a raised eyebrow, a change in breathing. Hans would start tapping, and once he noticed a reaction, however micro, from the human, he would stop. And just like that, it looked like he had gotten the answer right. I mean, he did get the answer right, but not really of his own accord, right? This phenomenon where the involuntary or unconscious movement influences cues or the outcome of a test or interaction became known as the idiomotor effect, and it is what skeptics claim is happening in FC. They argue that facilitators, without meaning to, are subtly guiding the speller through body positioning, posture, timing, or micro movements. It's not that they're faking it or being deceptive, it's that they're unconsciously directing the outcome, just like the humans around Hans were unconsciously signaling to him when to stop tapping. It sounds like a tidy explanation, but this is where, thankfully, Becca's brain kicked in and she said, wait, that cannot be what's happening here. Because in order for Clever Hans to get the answer right, he had to scan the options. For example, with 2 plus 3 equals 5, he would tap 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, pausing, though, for any sign that he'd hit the right number. He didn't know that the answer was 5. He was gradually working towards it, waiting for a subtle sign to stop. But that's not what these spellers are doing. They're not scanning the letterboards, hovering over every option, waiting for a facilitator's eyebrow to twitch. That would become obvious very quickly, and it would take forever. But let's go ahead and entertain that idea for just a second. If that is what is happening, if spellers are somehow picking up on tiny micro movements and cues from facilitators, then how are we also claiming that these same people are completely unintelligent, unaware, and not really in there? How can someone hold both of those opinions at the same time? If they're in there enough to pick up on subtle cues and respond with meaningful actions and reactions, then doesn't that prove someone is in there? But again, that's not even what's happening, right? These spellers aren't scanning the letterboards. Go watch for yourself, if not on the Telepathy Tapes website, in the Spellers documentary, or in any number of videos that you can find on YouTube. You'll see they're not scanning. It's just impossible. It's just not what's happening. And Becca points out that actually none of these studies prove that idiomotor is what's happening. It's just become the go-to assumption. But the truth is, we don't have a verified explanation yet. Even Becca says she doesn't know why message passing or double-blind tests haven't been passed yet, but that doesn't mean that nothing is going on. If anything, it kind of makes it more interesting. If it's not the idiomotor effect, because the spellers aren't scanning every letter, how do they know what the facilitator saw? Is it telepathy? Is it shared consciousness? Which, speaking of the facilitator, the critics really do not like the need for one of those at all. And one of the teachers from episode 5 pops in this episode again, and she mentions that some of the spellers can't type with just anyone because their energy signatures might not align. She explained that for some people, having that trusted person in the room, someone who is safe, familiar, and energetically regulated, makes it possible can make it possible for the non-speakers to be in their body enough to type or spell. And that kind of idea doesn't hold up in a lab. But if that's part of what's happening, why is it automatically dismissed? Skeptics call it disqualifying, but what if it's just necessary? In the podcast, they talk about how materialists want everything to be buttoned up, sterile, systematically and rigorously controlled. And I get that, I really do. But what I'm also starting to understand is that maybe not everything fits inside that framework. Just because someone can't perform under the exact conditions that skeptics demand, just because they might need to be in a state of trust or connection that science hasn't somehow figured out how to measure, doesn't mean that this communication isn't there and that it's not happening. Becca adds that in all the studies she looked into, there are anti-FC ones like the Kazuka study out of Japan that, in her professional opinion, were poorly designed with cherry-picked data and clear signs of confirmation bias. And yet those are the ones that are constantly cited. Meanwhile, studies like the Jaswal eye tracking study that we talked about in the last episode routinely get left out of the conversation, specifically because they don't include one of these double-blind message passing tests. Becca also brings up some ideas from fields like information theory and psychophysics, really dense topics, but they offer some useful ways to think about what's actually happening here. Information theory at its core is about how information moves from one point to another and how that signal might make it through the noise, what the limits of communication are. When you apply that to FC, the key takeaway is that there is just no way that a facilitator could be guiding letter by letter communication with subtle unconscious cues. It's just not possible according to information theory, and materialists love information theory. So psychophysics, meanwhile, looks at how we process and respond to stimuli, basically how the outside world interacts with our inner experience. And that starts to explain why things like trust or context or energetic alignment might matter more than we originally thought. So while the skeptics want clean, clear-cut proof with rigid controls, these frameworks remind us that human communication, especially in cases like FC, might involve more nuanced, complex processes that science just hasn't fully come to understand yet. It's not just about whether the message passes a message passing test. It's about comprehending the deeper mechanisms of how we connect and share information and meaning. So with all of that in mind, let's widen the lens, because this conversation is about more than just spelling or even telepathy. It's about the many, many different ways in which people are finding to connect and communicate and share information, often ways that don't fit into our existing frameworks, which is why it's actually time to meet a few more telepaths. First, we meet Ben by way of his father, Arthur. Right now, Ben is in his 50s, labeled as severely autistic and completely nonverbal, and he and his parents actually live in Israel. Like Joe, who we met in the last episode, Arthur is a retired lawyer, but for the past 30 years or so, he has been documenting the rise and resistance of spelling-based communication in the education system. So this man has a wealth of knowledge. Arthur and his family originally hail from the US in what he described as a modern and highly educated community in Massachusetts. But his son Ben wanted a different life. At 19, Ben learned to spell, and at 22, he asked his family to move to Israel to become part of a more traditional and spiritual community, Orthodox. And this is where things start to take a turn, because according to Arthur, like the others that we've met before, Ben is telepathic. But beyond that, he apparently channels thousands and thousands of spiritual messages. literally thousands, and it seems like they're taken very seriously. Arthur says that at one point they were printing around 80,000 copies of Ben's messages every single week to distribute all throughout Israel. These messages from Ben are now often in Hebrew, and Arthur says that while Hebrew isn't his personal strong suit, longstanding and respected rabbis have been reviewing Ben's messages, and they found that everything aligns with traditional scripture and Jewish law. And that's a really big claim. Arthur traces their telepathic connection back to April of 1994, not long after Ben began spelling. That's when he first became aware that something deeper was happening. And Ky points out that this isn't uncommon. She's heard from other spellers and their families that spelling often acts kind of as a gateway, a door that opens to things like telepathy, which Ben and Arthur also now practice two-way telepathy. And according to Arthur, Ben is very clear. What he is doing isn't psychic, it's spiritual. It's a gift from God. And we've heard that before. Amelia from the last episode describes her abilities as gifts from God, and her parents aren't even religious. Additionally, Ben has a unique way of accessing information. For example, Asher, who is the non-speaker that we've discussed previously, can apparently place his hand on a book and absorb information from inside. Ben will access information in someone's mind that has read the book to get it. Again, a very big claim and something we've heard before. Something similar happens when Akil is able to reference things that his mother was watching or listening to. And I think it was John Paul that actually was able to understand Harry Potter from accessing his sister's mind who had previously read it. So anyway, that's Ben. Spelling, spiritual downloads, thousands of channeled messages. But what about people who never learned to spell at all? What about people like Kyle? Kyle was 38 at the time of recording the Telepathy Tapes, and he lives in Cornwall, England with his mom, Caroline. Unlike Ben, Kyle doesn't spell, and he never has. But his mom, Caroline, has always felt like there was a deep nonverbal bond that went deeper than the typical intuition or motherly connection. It seemed to her to be something akin to telepathy. She said that she didn't mention it for years and years until around 2020 or 21 when she decided to host an online discussion where she reached out to the greater community and asked if anyone else had ever felt like they had had a telepathic connection or experience with autistic people in their care. And one by one, parents, teachers, professionals from all over Europe signed up to join this discussion. But this is where I have to bring up that, yes, Kyle and his mother experienced two-way telepathy, but really this all started in her dreams, in lucid dreams. And before I explain where Kyle and Caroline first started communicating via lucid dreams, we have to discuss what those actually are. You've probably heard the term, but just in case, essentially it is when you become aware that you're dreaming when you are still within the dream. That awareness gives you a kind of agency. You can move around, you can be intentional, ask questions, make decisions, and shape the experience around you. From everything that I have read, watched, or listened to, lucid dreaming seems to come naturally to some people, while others can learn how to do it with practice and methods. There are a ton of techniques out there and probably 1,000,001 videos on YouTube, all trying to help people get this to happen. I have tried 1,000 times. I've never been able to do it, but I know it's real. So also, if you've had any experience with lucid dreaming, I would love to hear about it in the comments. And actually, while you're there, if you are still watching and you are enjoying this series and enjoying this video, tapping like or subscribe would mean so much to me. It does more than you would know. And it's just a quiet way of helping me know I should keep going. There's another way of supporting the channel in the description box. I don't even like mentioning it because it's still very weird, but it's there. So anyway, let's move on. Now that we are all on the same page about what lucid dreaming is, let me tell you how it became the communication bridge between Kyle and his mom. The first time it happened, Kyle was around 8 years old. Caroline had a dream and Kyle was there. And she said he kept looking at her, not speaking yet, just staring at her as if trying to tell her to wake up, but she didn't, at least not right away. So Kyle did something out of pocket. He grabbed the ace of spades. I had one. And he folded it and he tore it into little holes in the way someone does when making a snowflake out of computer paper. And then he held it up to his eye and he said verbally, "Wake up." It gives me chills. Anyway, it worked on Caroline as well. And she snapped into lucidity and became conscious within the dream. And then suddenly Kyle was speaking to her with words. He explained that he could talk to her in dreams, but that she needed to wake up within them so that she could remember them the next day, thus making the conversations worthwhile in their waking conscious experience. That night, Caroline eventually fell into a deeper sleep. And the next morning, while they were in the kitchen and he was sitting at the table, Kyle pulled the ace of spades out of a deck of cards that was sitting there, and he held it up to his eye, confirming everything that she had dreamt about the night before. And I cannot imagine what that moment must have felt like to her. It sounds like a movie, and it reminds me of Everything Everywhere All at Once, which personally I think is just one of the all-time best movies ever. And I'm not even going to argue about it. If you don't like Everything Everywhere, I don't think we can have a conversation. And that is really what it's kind of like for Caroline and Kyle. This experience created a bridge between them, and Kyle will do something out of pocket to wake Caroline up when she's sleeping so that they can converse. So this kind of makes me wonder, what does this say about the dream state? I mean, if Kyle can meet Caroline in her dreams and wake her up inside of them, what does that mean the rest of us are doing when we're sleeping and dreaming, even if we don't remember it the next day? I mean, clearly something. Caroline has to be somewhere for Kyle to find her, which kind of implies we're all somewhere, wherever there is. You see what I'm saying? It also reminds me, I made a short about this, but my therapist once told me to give my subconscious an assignment before bed, something to work on or a problem to solve. And honestly, it's really been working for me. And I'll link that in the description box, or maybe I'll insert it or something. And if I need to make a longer video about it, let me know. But when I think about Kyle and Caroline's dream conversations, and I pair that with the idea of giving your subconscious something to work on while you're sleeping and seeing results from that as if there actually was a version of you doing the work, I don't know what it means, but I'm fascinated. Anyway, Ky explains that the idea of dream bridging or dream communication isn't new. In some indigenous circles, it has been used for centuries to allow shamans to speak with spirits and ancestors. Mongolian and Siberian traditions describe soul journeying, which is the belief that consciousness can travel through dreams into other realms, even other people's dreams, which Kyle can apparently also do. He has shown up in the dreams of friends, families, even strangers, always doing something odd to try and jolt them into lucidity. Again, very everything everywhere. And it's like he's trying to break through the ordinary until they're lucid, and then he can speak to them. But his dream communication remains primarily with his mom. She says that the more often they do it, the easier it becomes. And as of the time of the recording of the podcast, they were doing it a few times a week regularly. She also explains that their communication did evolve. Now she and Kyle experience two-way telepathy while awake. When Kyle wants to communicate telepathically, she says it feels like there's a knock on her mental door, or a sensation of being stared at almost, which, as we know, is something Rupert Sheldrake studied. She adds that once she feels that invisible mental pressure, she takes it as her cue to empty her mind and clear her thoughts to allow room for Kyle's thoughts to enter, which really makes me think I need to be meditating more. Anyway, she says it feels like a telepathic download when it comes through. And Ky compares that to creative downloads experienced by people like Paul McCartney, Mary Shelley, Nikola Tesla, and even Ky herself. I don't think I've had something arrive fully formed like that, but when I get a sudden creative idea, it does kind of feel like it drops in from somewhere else. It's like a rush, like something just lands in my mind and I don't question it. And I just know, not that it's a good idea necessarily, but that it's true, or that it will come into existence. And it's really just up to me to decide if I want to take action and be the one that brings it in. It reminds me of that Mark Twain mental telegraphy, where he wrote a letter to a friend that he hadn't spoken to in like over a decade or something. And it was about a book idea, and a few weeks later, he got a letter back in the mail that was postmarked the same day he sent his letter, and it was from his friend with the same book idea, meaning they sent it at the same time. It's those kinds of stories, or the stories of inventions being done at the same time from opposite sides of the world by inventors that were completely unaware of each other. I don't know, but I love it. It makes the whole creative process feel less like making something up and more like tuning into something that's trying to come through. It's kind of what I think Kai's trying to get at. It's also actually what the artist way talks about in a lot of ways, how creativity isn't necessarily something to be made up, but rather something to put down and get out. Anyway, back to Kyle, beyond dream communication and telepathy, there's actually more. At 24 years old, he began music therapy. And when his therapist brought over a keyboard for the very first time, Kyle, this severely autistic, nonverbal young man, very unexpectedly started singing and playing a song called Sealed with a Kiss. No training, no lessons. She'd never heard him do it before. He just did it. And Caroline says he has perfect pitch and that he can pick up almost any instrument and play it by ear. And now when he wants something like food or water or help, he doesn't always use dreams or telepathy to communicate. Sometimes he just sings a song that fits the moment, something relevant to what's going on. Apparently, he knows thousands of songs, all stored in his mind, kind of like an emotional archive. And Caroline clarifies that this is not echolalia, I think that's how you say it, which is essentially just repeating things that you hear, because that doesn't allow room for intention. And Kyle chooses these songs based on the moment at hand, conveying simple things like hunger and exhaustion, as well as complex emotions like feeling misunderstood or lonely. And beyond that, Kyle doesn't want to simply repeat and perform the songs of others. He actually wants to make his own music. So Caroline leaned in. She got him support, got him a producer, and she got to work, essentially downloading the lyrics and the melodies and everything in between from Kyle via telepathy when awake, as well as through lucid dreaming when asleep. And now Kyle has 2 full albums out and a 3rd one in the works. I mean, isn't that incredible? We have heard countless ways in which quote unquote experts are constantly saying that these nonverbal autistic people are simply not in there. And then we have someone like Kyle who pops up and starts demonstrating that for someone who's not in there, he sure does know how to sing and play a lot of instruments. It also makes me think, and I don't know if there is actually any relation to this, probably not, but it makes me think about how some people who struggle with vocal stuttering may find that they don't stutter when they sing. Again, I have no idea. There's probably nothing related, but it makes me think of that. It's very interesting. Anyway, Kyle's incredible. I've linked his website in the description box. He has an album out called Beyond the Syntax that Caroline explains that it is about the experience of being autistic in this world. And I'm not kidding. He has this song, oh my gosh, what is it called? Just Listen. And it has been stuck in my head on a loop the whole time I have been writing and researching this. And it just makes me smile because I like to think that since he is telepathic, that maybe he knows when someone's listening to it, or maybe he knows when someone's singing it, or it's in someone's head. And I have no idea. But if you can hear me, Kyle, hello. Big fan. Anyway, Caroline has this metaphor she uses to describe how she thinks all of this works. She talks about different bandwidths of understanding, but I'm going to use the word frequencies just because it aligns with the radio example that I've been using throughout this series, even if it's not the most accurate word to use. Caroline believes that the first frequency is what we would consider conventional language, spoken words, typical expression. The second one is more creative. It's where she and Kyle connect telepathically, both while awake and asleep, where she can essentially download lyrics and melodies that he's sharing with her, among other things. And then there is a third frequency, which she describes as something kind of like the collective consciousness. She believes that the more you expand your awareness, the more you can access information, connection, or communication that goes beyond the self. And I love this idea. And Ky reiterates that we've previously heard non-speakers talk about visiting other realms to connect with higher powers for information sharing repeatedly at this point. And now she's once again wondering if this is possible in part because these people are less bound to their bodies. Anyway, the last thing I want to add when it comes to Caroline and Kyle is that Caroline said that many of the people that joined her online discussion, the people who had experienced telepathic interaction with autistic individuals in their care, several of them, many of them came forward and said that they had been to the Hill. And I think that's awesome because I really hope to visit someday, but like no big deal. It would be cool. Anyway, at the end of the episode, Ky makes it clear that the gatekeeping of this information is still very much alive and well. Ben's dad, Arthur, references countless instances of people facing repercussions for speaking out. Again, he's got the names, dates, and documents, and he mentions Anne Donnellan, once considered one of the top autism researchers in the world, who spoke up about simply being open to the possibility of telepathy within the autism community, and she lost a lot professionally because of it. And Ky believes that we're still seeing this today because if people start believing that these kids are actually communicating, then they also have to start to grapple with what these kids are communicating. Because it's not just about them being in there or about sharing feelings or needs. They're communicating spiritual experiences. They are talking about interconnectedness. They're worried about the earth, and they are aware of planetary possibilities within the universe. They want to talk about new forms of science, new forms of education, new ways of parenting. It's going to bring about an absolute and complete shift in communication, not to mention a total paradigm shift. And that's a lot to consider. And that makes it really easy for some people to dismiss. But what if it's all true? I mean, really, that's it for today's episode. Thank you guys so much for being here. You have no idea how much it means. The next episode is going to be emotional, but I can't wait, and I'll have it out as soon as possible. I really appreciate you guys sticking around. Please start thinking about what you want me to talk about next, because I only have 2 more episodes until this series is done. I may jump in when the second season comes out. It just kind of depends. I don't want my whole channel devoted to someone else's content, but this is really important work. So I don't know. I'm really excited, but I'm glad you're here. I hope I am in focus. I hope the sound doesn't suck. Everything has worked against me today, but I am here. I am done. I am going to post this bitch no matter what. Love you guys. Nope.